The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 10. The Herd. Melchizedek was standing in front of the eye watching a prison riot in Syria, but his attention was quickly diverted to a city park in Vigo, Pontevedra, Spain. Melchizedek frowned. Lorena, an apprentice dispenser, had just materialised into an area of very low vibration. She was fully actualised without anti-force, a red flag if ever there was one. Lorena was sitting on a park bench near a highly concentrated area of negative energy. Melchizedek knew this would be a real challenge for her. Melchizedek knew this because he knew everything, because he was everything. He was the creator and the created. He had been an experiential participant of his own evolution, bringing into being over 7 billion souls, all emanations of their creator, who will eventually be able to do as he had done, and greater. Melchizedek, the all-seeing and the all-knowing, knew how many hairs were on the Prince of Wales's head, how many grains of sand were on Copacabana Beach, and how many lies were told across the globe that day, and by whom and to whom. Melchizedek knew how many marbles were manufactured in China last December, the previous incarnations of everyone working the production line, and their worst fears, and how they overcame them. Melchizedek knew how many souls were in their mother's womb, and the precise number of scales on their forming skin. Melchizedek knew how many butterflies met their death by windshield that day. Melchizedek knew the contents of every book ever written, because he was the author. So how Lorena could have been so utterly naive as to think he would not notice her little trip made the godson laugh. She really was a little imp, full of herself, bold as brass, a bit like Sarah but not as self-assured. At this moment Sarah was still living in the town she loathed, and flagrantly rebellious against the rules and regulations others had no trouble respecting, and she had only just turned 14. Melchizedek had always thought Lorena to be more of a conformist, content to follow the herd. But then Lorena was a calmer free soul, possessing a full measure of free will. Maybe she was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and not a member of the herd at all. The only moments excluded from the godson, and by his choice early on of course, were of a personal kind, toilet, sex, and the innocent occasion any soul would doubtless consider embarrassing. The eye was an age-old portal through which Melchizedek could see all his creations as if they were standing in front of him, live, up close and personal. Through it the creator observed the created. Through it the creator observes himself. "We are all emanations of the only energy that exists," said Melchizedek forcefully to anyone with ears to hear. He knew who they were. "Jesus fucking Christ, why is it so damn hard?" shouted Ron. Melchizedek abruptly removed his attention from Lorena's life and tuned into the man who had just taken his name in vain for the 28th time that week. "The prison door is open, Ron. Walk through it," said Melchizedek, but he knew that Ron's thoughts were so belligerent he wouldn't have heard a lion roar if standing in front of him. Melchizedek again was tempted to take his attention back to Lorena, but Ron was having a hard time controlling his thoughts, and the godson felt it necessary to stay with the level 2 soul for a little while longer. Ron was lying in bed, unable to calm his mind, not that he would have known what that meant. Sleep had not given him the reprieve he had yearned for, and now he was angry. Ron had never believed in God or a bigger picture, and thought that only simple-minded people did. The only big picture he had ever seen was that life was an unfortunate and never-ending battle. He had no idea he was actually creating that battle, and had no idea that he would be required to endure his creations until he woke up to the magnitude of his own being. Melchizedek knew that Ron would get it eventually, for all souls eventually did. Ron finally fell asleep but woke up from a bad dream with the same frown lines on his forehead that had been creasing it for the past 50 years. Ron switched on the lamp. The 100-watt bulb stung his eyes. He reached for the alarm that should have gone off and shook it, and the batteries fell out. Good job I wasn't relying on that useless piece of Chinese crap. Ron picked up his water and took a sip, not noticing the moth floating on the top that had drowned in it. He spat the water out and the moth back into the glass. Ron flung the covers back and climbed out of bed, rubbing his lower back. He stubbed his toe on the bed frame and didn't bother opening the blinds. More lousy weather, he growled as he walked into the kitchen to make some coffee. There was only half a teaspoon of instant left in the jar. Jesus, I'm not asking for much, just a cup of goddamn coffee. Melchizedek laughed. Ron had only ever called him Jesus and only ever called out when he was upset about something. He wanted to remind Ron that there was a jar of coffee in the pantry behind the oatmeal, and he wanted to remind Ron that happiness was not possible without at first creating the mindset necessary to attract the mirror experience. Still your mind. Appreciate what you have so more can be supplied. It's so simple, Ron. Melchizedek laughed. Ron had only ever called him Jesus and only called him at all when he was upset. He wanted to remind Ron that there was a jar of coffee in the pantry behind the oatmeal, and he wanted to remind him that happiness was not possible without at first creating the mindset necessary to attract the mirror experience. Still your mind, Ron. Appreciate what you have so more can be supplied. It's so simple, Ron. Life is a mirror. Ron's mind did not permit him to appreciate anything. He toasted some bread, whole grain, which he hated, but the doctor said he needed more fibre. It toasted unevenly. He then walked into the bathroom to get ready for work. The water had left an orange stain in the shower stall, and he knew he would have to check the filtration system again. The last time he was out there, several wasps nesting under the awning had stung him on the forehead. Melchizedek watched Ron slam his front door and then watched him climb into his work van and slam that door. Ron had slammed a lot of doors during his lifetime. Ron, a plumber with 30 years solid experience, resented his boss, who didn't appreciate his skills and sent him on all the crappy jobs. He had been promised a company work van, but that never seemed to materialise and probably never would. Ron turned the key in the ignition of his old van, and it took a few tries for the engine to kick to life. The alternator had not been charging the battery, which was new, so now he would have to make another trip back to AutoZone. He hated going there, full of young whippersnappers who didn't know their asses from their elbows. The rain was heavy and his wipers needed new blades. Ron squinted as he headed east into the rain, and the traffic exhausted what little patience he had left. He should have known better than to listen to the news on the radio. The economy was worsening and the property prices were plummeting. He had bought his house 2 years ago at the height of the property boom, and now it was worth less than half of what he owed. Ron's boss had directed him to unblock a drain in a housing complex on the other side of town. He wasn't even offered so much as a thimble of water by the owner, a goddamn foreigner. Ron waded his way through 3 more jobs after that, trying to avoid unmuzzled dogs and nosy children. He then stopped at the supermarket. It was past 8. The checkout line was long, and the woman in front of him had a pile of coupons. Jesus Christ, it's only Monday, Ron muttered as he rammed his shopping cart into the stack of others. You will live 1 billion Mondays and then some, Ron, said Melchizedek. Now is the only relevant moment. But his words fell on deaf ears. When Ron arrived home, he retrieved a pile of letters from the mailbox that some idiot had backed into the week before. It was still crooked. Bills and flyers only. He then listened to his phone messages. The fraud department of a credit card company had called. Some little shit had used his card, and then he heard Donald's voice asking to borrow money. How the hell did I end up having such a flake for a brother? He seethed, reaching for the remote. Ron turned on the TV and then began unpacking the groceries. The coffee jar slipped out of his hands and smashed on the tile. The granules flew everywhere. Ron listened to the news anchor talk about rising gas prices. She had a high-pitched voice that grated on his nerves, and the picture on his old dinosaur of a TV was starting to look fuzzy. Jesus, what a shit life this is. Melchizedek did not flinch. Not only had Ron been calling out his name in vain that day, he had been doing it all week, and the week before that, and the one before that. There is a better way, Ron. Focus. Listen. Heed. Focus. Ron's thoughts were too frenetic to hear anything. He put a ready meal in the microwave, Salisbury steak that was tasteless and frozen in the middle. He threw it in the trash and looked out of the window. The streetlight had been flickering for weeks and the county had not bothered to repair it. The garbage collector had dropped a bag that morning and the contents were strewn right across Ron's front lawn. Ron went outside to pick up the mess. His cheerful new neighbour was outside leaving seed for the goddamn birds, which Ron would have shot if he got half the chance. He pretended not to notice her. He preferred to keep himself to himself. Ron climbed into a cold bed just after 10 p.m. He could hear the tap dripping in the bathroom. He kept forgetting to replace the washer. Ron pulled the pillow over his head, ready to battle another restless night. When he did finally sleep, he dreamt of his ex-wife and his estranged children. He then dreamt that faulty wiring had caused his house to burn down and awoke during the early hours with a raging thirst. He reached for his glass. The dead moth was still floating in last night's water. Melchizedek brought into his awareness the specifics of Ron's life plan. The option of a stroke had been included by Ron himself. If a drastic change in his thinking did not occur, in 91 days Ron would spend the rest of his life in a nursing home, paralysed, unable to feed himself and needing round-the-clock care. Would he get any visitors? Probably not. Would his brother move into his house? Probably. The purpose of the stroke would be to impede Ron's left-brain thinking. In that condition he would only see life through the eyes of his soul, a right brain function. Without the meddling of his thinking mind, illusion would be gone and the truth would look beautiful. Melchizedek recounted Ron's most recent lifetime. This was not the first time he had become stuck. Shock therapy is sometimes utilised to get a soul unstuck, and Ron was probably too far in to recover by any other means. Melchizedek understood the logic behind Ron's backup plan entirely. If he had been his guide, he would have recommended the same thing. The thinking mind's capacity to deceive the thinker was endless, and the human journey required that deceptive low-grade thoughts be nipped in the bud before physical manifestation occurred. Ron had not managed this. Ron had spent his adult life projecting his dissatisfaction, selecting enemies in every conceivable form: his brother, the dentist, his boss, the toll booth attendant, the neighbour's cat. His thinking mind liked to anticipate the reactions of his enemies, and this fictitious internal dialogue always concluded with Ron putting everyone back in line. He had always felt that it was his job in life to tell others like it was. Somebody needed to. Ron caused and then spread a gloomy darkness wherever he went, and what life gave back to him was a mirror of this chaos, externally and internally. The noise in Ron's head often became so intense that his private thoughts turned public. The noise in Ron's head often made him want to scream. Melchizedek shook his head ruefully. The law of magnetism which he had designed couldn't be simpler, and yet much of humanity still remained ignorant of the fact that the physical events of life always began as a thought. But then, if those entering the physical were only in possession of their divine mind, the training ground Melchizedek called Earth, a kindergarten for gods in the making, would serve absolutely no purpose. The purpose of sending beings into the physical was so they could learn to consciously focus their attention in order to call forth the unseen, the constant seduction of the anti-force compelling them to do so, to make a choice moment by moment. Melchizedek now took his attention back to Lorena. The apprentice dispenser was still sitting on the park bench in Spain. She looked rather insipid under the murky streetlight. Melchizedek laughed. Lorena had bargained for so little, a trivial distraction, a quick jaunt, but it was unlikely her little excursion would be inconsequential. For now, Melchizedek remained glued to Lorena's evening sojourn, but she was a creature of free will, which meant he would not be able to hand her a fluffy white bathrobe if she got into trouble.